People hear oil geopolitics and think it's a cold, distant chess game. But if you've ever watched a person control you through access, timing, and leverage, you already understand the psychology of this story. And you've probably ignored the signs in your own life. A new war is forming, quiet enough to pretend it isn't happening. No tanks rolling down streets yet. No dramatic headlines every day. The violence is already built into the supply chains, into the price mechanisms, into the ability to starve someone without lifting a finger. And the uncomfortable truth is this: whoever controls energy access is also controlling behavior, alliances, and survival. That is the real battlefield. Welcome back to The Hidden Self. In this episode, we're not going to talk about oil like it's a commodity. We're going to talk about it like it's a psychological weapon, the kind that doesn't just win markets, but rewires who feels safe, who feels desperate, and who ends up begging for permission to breathe. You're going to hear a story about the United States, about China, and about countries that get treated like assets instead of humans. But beneath the policy language is something darker and more personal. It's the logic of coercion. It's the logic of punishment disguised as stability. It's the logic of building a backup plan when the world is lying to you, and when the people in charge want you to believe there is no alternative. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, because this isn't only about nations. It's about power patterns that show up in relationships, workplaces, and money habits every single day. Let's start with the obvious part, then we'll go under it. The first uncomfortable truth is that energy control is not about physics, it's about leverage. And leverage is always psychological before it is mechanical. When people say demand and supply, they're describing the surface. Underneath, control comes from who decides timing, who decides access, and who decides what normal looks like. If you've ever been in a situation where you had to ask permission to do the most basic thing, you know the feeling. Even if nobody raises their voice, you feel smaller. You feel your agency shrinking. You feel like your future is being negotiated by someone else. That's what energy access does to governments. That's why this oil chessboard matters. Crude oil is not just fuel, it's logistics, it's electricity, it's transportation, it's manufacturing, it's medicine, it's food production, it's everything that makes modern life feel automatic. So when a major power tries to control oil at the source, it isn't merely trying to profit, it's trying to shape outcomes. It's trying to keep certain countries dependent, certain markets predictable, and certain leaders afraid. The United States has long treated its influence like a protective roof. In their language, it's security. In practice, it often functions like custody. The logic is simple: if you're in the backyard, you don't get to make independent choices that threaten the house. To understand how that logic becomes violence without calling itself violence, look at Venezuela. Venezuela is not just an oil country, it's an oil argument. It's a test case for what happens when a resource-rich country refuses to behave like a loyal customer. Venezuela has proven reserves that are immense, but the more important detail is the cost of extraction. In this story, the economics become a weapon against the victim. If you can pump oil cheaply, you're harder to pressure through price. If you can stay profitable when global prices fall, you don't collapse on schedule. And if you don't collapse, you don't become easy to steer. From a control perspective, that's unacceptable. A country that can survive without begging is a country that can negotiate. A country that can negotiate can eventually defy, and defiance is contagious. So the playbook is not, we disagree. The playbook is, we destabilize. In 1999, Hugo Chavez took power and did something that the controlling class can't tolerate. He nationalized the oil industry, not in a symbolic way, in a structural way. He took the keys away from foreign corporate extraction and redirected oil money into social systems: housing, healthcare, education, subsidized fuel. For people who benefit from dependency, this feels like betrayal. Not because it is immoral in some abstract sense, but because it threatens the system of extraction where profits flow outward and local people get crumbs. Now here's the psychological mechanism people miss. When you nationalize a resource, you're not only changing who gets revenue, you're changing who controls legitimacy, you're changing who gets to claim the nation's future, you're changing the identity story. We are not a supplier for your comfort, we are the owners of our survival. That kind of identity threat triggers a different kind of response. When the situation worsened, especially around 2020 when oil prices collapsed and the pandemic deepened the blow, Venezuela became vulnerable. Vulnerability is always what powerful actors look for, not necessarily the victim's moral position, not fairness. Vulnerability. Then comes the pressure, sanctions described as policy, but operating like a slow tightening tourniquet. The state can't get upgrades, infrastructure can't be maintained. Critical imports become harder. Expansion becomes impossible. The government loses the ability to do the one thing that keeps social stability afloat: invest, repair, and subsidize. And when a state can no longer fund basic needs, the population experiences it as betrayal from reality itself. You don't just feel poor, you feel trapped. You feel lied to by the future. In the chaos, the controlling power expects a predictable outcome. The narrative becomes, look, the system failed. Look, the leadership must go. Look, only outside help can restore order. But the final truth is simpler. The controlling power isn't trying to rescue a country, it's trying to regain control of the resource channel. Politics becomes the costume for extraction. That's why the story pivots from economic pressure to political and military messaging. The labeling is aggressive. Maduro is called illegitimate, a threat, a criminal figure. There are rewards, there are threats of force. There is always a psychological aim to fracture internal unity and force leadership into impossible choices. When you give people an either surrender or survive scenario, you're not debating ethics, you're manufacturing desperation. And when leaders become desperate, they start negotiating under humiliation. That's when the real power shows up, the power to write the terms while pretending it's the broker of peace. If you want the micro-level feeling of what sanctions do, imagine a person whose income source is cut while their bills remain. At first there is rage, then there is bargaining, then there is improvisation, then there is exhaustion, then there is collapse. The controlling actor hopes the target reaches the stage where compromise feels like relief. The United States, in this logic, uses time as a weapon, not bombs, not always, time. Now the uncomfortable truth. Once you understand the Venezuela pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Because the next target in this playbook is Nigeria. Nigeria is oil, yes. But the deeper issue from the perspective of the controlling power is not the oil itself, it's the direction of influence. Nigeria has energy resources and refining relevance. Certain oil qualities are valuable because they make it easier to produce refined products cheaply. In a world where profit and logistics are everything, easy to refine oil becomes strategic. But again, the psychology of power isn't satisfied with resources, it's obsessed with alignment. Washington sees Nigeria shifting closer to China, and China doesn't arrive with the same kind of moral theater. It arrives with investment, infrastructure, and long-term agreements. It invests across sectors, not only extraction. That makes the relationship feel more durable. From the controlling side, this creates a nightmare scenario, a resource-rich partner that is building independence. So a similar destabilization narrative begins. Claims are made about religious persecution and missing people. The point is not whether every detail is true. The point is whether the story creates permission for intervention, and here the mind of the controlling power is revealed. It's the same pattern you've seen in toxic relationships. You bring a justified sounding accusation to create a moral license, so that control can be framed as protection. But the mechanism is the same as always. If there is no evidence strong enough to justify the action, you still try to influence perceptions. You still push an emotional trigger. You still create urgency. You still make it feel dangerous to resist you. And you do it because you need a certain outcome to increase instability, expand foreign presence, and tighten control before another competitor locks in the resource channel. Now you might think, this is all very geopolitical. What does it have to do with me? It has everything to do with you, because your life is also a competition for control patterns. You just call it love, career, family, or stability. In relationships, people who want control don't necessarily threaten you openly. They create pressure through guilt. They create urgency through drama. They create consequences through silence. They create a moral narrative that makes you feel like resistance is cruelty. That is what happens when a state uses human suffering as a storyline to justify intervention. The hidden engine is coercion dressed as concern. So far, we've talked about one system's method: destabilize, pressure, isolate, then offer order that conveniently restores control of the resource channel. It's a siege logic. It's a punitive logic. It's a logic of dependency. But then China enters the scene and plays a different psychological game. And here is where the story becomes frightening. The second uncomfortable truth is that building reserves is a form of psychological autonomy. And autonomy always threatens empires. China's strategy is described as quiet, patient, and defensive. While the United States is busy with political and military moves, China is busy with the least glamorous weapon in history: stockpiles. They accumulate crude oil at levels that shock the world. The key is that it's not for immediate consumption, it's for long-term insurance. It's for shock absorption. It's for reducing vulnerability to external disruptions. Here's the psychological point. Dependency makes you controllable. Reserves make you harder to control. When you store enough to survive a period of import interruption, you change your emotional relationship to risk. Instead of panicking at every external threat, you can act with calculation. You can wait out price spikes. You can refuse deals that are unfavorable. You can negotiate. This is why the world reacts to China's storage behavior, not because it's smart, though it is smart, but because it removes leverage from whoever used to pressure through scarcity. If you are used to having a lever and the target stops reacting, you start feeling powerless. Empires hate feeling powerless because the empire's identity is built on being the decider. China, by contrast, behaves like someone who refuses to live inside other people's schedules. And they don't stop at public reserves. They encourage private stockpiling through new energy legislation that expands the reserve base. It turns the reserve strategy into a broader cultural and corporate habit. It creates a national reflex, protect the system before the crisis. But the hidden self-question is this: why do you personally avoid building your own reserves? Why do you keep living day to day, paycheck to paycheck, without a cushion? Why do you keep tolerating unstable situations because you tell yourself you'll be fine later? That's not a financial problem only, it's an identity problem. It's the belief that you don't control your future. It's the belief that survival depends on external approval. China is refusing that belief. It is building a buffer so that panic doesn't drive policy. In psychological terms, it's emotional regulation at national scale. And that emotional regulation has a strategic payoff because when the reserve exists, China can become more than a customer. It can become a stabilizing buyer. It can buy from countries under sanctions when others cannot. That's where the defensive reserve becomes an offensive instrument. When China buys discounted oil from sanctioned rivals, it does two things at once. It gets cheap resources and it undermines the sanctions regime. It creates an alternative pathway for commerce. It offers a life raft to targeted states. Those states, in turn, gain bargaining power. Now look at the micro level. In your life, the parallel is obvious. If one person controls your options, they control you. If you build additional options, their pressure loses effect. In job relationships, if you have no exit plan, you tolerate disrespect. If you build skills, references, and a pipeline, the disrespect becomes less profitable for the abuser. In money, if you have no savings, every bill becomes a hostage situation. If you build reserves, you stop negotiating your dignity under stress. That is the real lesson. Reserves are not greed. Reserves are psychological freedom. China also aims to institutionalize this autonomy through new financial mechanisms and trading platforms. The story talks about energy exchange, infrastructure, and currency pathways that can reduce reliance on the US dollar in oil trading. Now, I want you to understand why this matters. Oil has historically been tied to a global pricing and payment system that benefits the US. If dollars are required for transactions, the system grants the US special financial power. It can finance wars, deficits, and imports with lower friction than others. It can freeze assets. It can shape outcomes by controlling currency access. So the petrodollar is not just a payment method, it's a control architecture. When China builds routes that allow oil to be priced and paid in other currencies, it chips away at that architecture. It weakens the empire's ability to sanction by financial blockade. It makes sanctions less absolute. And this is why the story is described as a battle for the future of energy order. Not because oil is romantic, because oil is structural. If you control the payment channel, you control the network. If you control the network, you can shape behavior across the entire system of producers and consumers. That's what makes this conflict so high stakes. It's not only about which nation pumps more oil this year, it's about which nation shapes the rules for how oil moves and how transactions survive political punishment. So, we've covered the two approaches. One tries to control by coercion and destabilization. The other tries to gain autonomy by reserves and alternative systems. Now we come to the deepest uncomfortable truth. The third uncomfortable truth is that both sides justify themselves, but only one side is changing the rules. And the rule-changing side is the one that scares the system. Let's name the psychological reality. Empires are designed to preserve their identity. That identity is often built on monopoly. Monopoly of payment, monopoly of influence, monopoly of security guarantees, monopoly of the narrative. When a rival builds an alternative system, it doesn't just compete economically, it threatens the legitimacy foundation. It tells the world, you had a choice and nobody told you. That is humiliating for the old leader. So the old leader responds with escalating pressure, sanctions, political delegitimization, claims of wrongdoing, military signaling. The language is always about morality, security, and stability, but the function is coercion. Meanwhile, the rival doesn't need to invade. It builds, it stockpiles, it trades. It creates redundancy. It turns vulnerability into strength and then uses that strength to gain influence. This is crucial. A system that relies on control cannot tolerate competition and resilience. It expects targets to panic. When targets don't panic, the empire's favorite tool becomes less effective. Now here's where the video's central metaphor becomes painfully relatable. The oil weapon is not a gun pointed at someone's head. It's a key. It opens doors to a different era. And the people who are threatened by the key aren't only those with power. They're also those with psychological investment in the old rules. Think about how many people in the world have built their identity around the idea that there is no alternative to the dominant system. They're not just investors, they're nations. They're institutions. They're everyday people who assume their lives are shaped by laws that cannot be changed. Once alternatives exist, the old system loses its ability to demand compliance. That triggers a specific psychological reaction, rage mixed with urgency. In Venezuela and Nigeria, pressure is applied to force choices. But the choices are rigged. It's presented as either align with us or be destroyed. That's a coercive binary. It's designed to collapse uncertainty until surrender seems like the only rational option. But if the target has reserves and alternatives, that binary becomes less effective. Then the coercer has two bad options: escalate into higher risk or lose influence. So what we're really watching is a crisis of control. Now let's step back even further and talk about the hidden self element, because this is where you'll feel the sting. If you've ever been controlled, you learn something inside you. The world is dangerous and you have to submit to survive. You might not even remember learning it, but it sits in your nervous system. Then you repeat it in jobs where you stay too long, in relationships where you accept less than you deserve, in financial decisions where you